Hey, welcome to the process. My name is Dr. John Bush. You've arrived at lesson 33. I'm continuing looking at running backs versus wide receivers, part 2. And we're looking at helping you win your fantasy football draft. So let's just jump right into it. Focusing in this case on running backs, there's always a question and there's controversy that can you use last year's rankings to predict this year's end of season fantasy point averages? And what about the uncertainty / variation using last year's number? Some people argue completely throw it out. Some people say, completely use it. Where do we stand on that? We'll actually use some statistics to answer that question. Okay, and it is what it's going to be. Okay, so I don't know where folks are thinking this is going to be, but we'll explore that. To begin with, I wanted to just show you the absolute data. And so what we have here is the rank last year from number 1, end of season rank, to the 72nd running back. Okay. And then the next year, I show you the fantasy points that the player that was ranked, for instance, number 1 last year scored the next year. So in 2013, the player that was number 1 in 2013 scored 257 fantasy points into season 2014. And the number 1 player in 2014 scored 111 points in 2015, and so forth. And you see that we had a nice big failure here, 15 points. And in 2020, we're talking, that was Christian McCaffrey, 90 points. And in 2015, 111. So of 7 years I looked at, 4 of those produced 250 or more. So that's probably pretty good if you think about it. But the failures, so 3 out of 7 were complete failures there. So they're, and you would think that's the best you got, and probably not so good even then. So there's risk involved. There's going to be variation in risk. Okay. So you think about that a little bit. It's nice to know that and at least have a way to look at, for instance, 2021 using 2020's last year rankings as a way to view, as a lens. No, we're not, digging in blood, signing the contract. I will completely follow last year, but it's good to know. And again, trying to establish averages, right? We've got to have something to base opinions and processes on. And so reference class forecasting is basically another a way that I use to develop those averages to make some conclusions. So you're free to look through this. I'm going to tease all this out and put some visualization to this. But here's the actual raw data here. You can see the further down you go, obviously, the less points you're going to get back. So there's something to be said if you look, say, 60th to 72nd here, not a lot of cases in 7 years times what, 12, that we actually saw something that was just like, wow, this is a sleeper. There was a couple right here, 199, 196, 175, but that's about it. So as far as success, look at the success rate here. Not so hot. So the idea that players that were finishing 60th to 72nd, that you should just throw it out and say, well, depends on what's going on. They can really do good for me. I would hesitate to bet on that. I certainly would not bet on that given the data. Okay, so that's why we develop data, to have probabilities and something to think about here. Okay, so you can just kind of scroll through this if you want and kind of just see what's out there. And, think about what it means. Okay, I frankly, when people say don't use or always use, the extremes, what are they basing that on? To me, here's the data. This is how you should look at it. So I'm at a loss. Would you make a pronouncement like that? Is this your analysis of this data, or did you even do this data? I don't know. I'm telling you, I did it. Here it is. Okay, so there's no secret data. Here's the data. It is what it is. Care what I wish for it to be, this is what it is. So that's what I'm going to give you. I'm only going to give you what the data says. Okay, and that's how I proceed. And I hope you consider that as a way to proceed as well. So a lot of times when you have a lot of raw data, it's convenient. Okay, now you choose that word carefully. Convenient to group sectors together to get a little bit more data points to get some clarity on any trends. And so that's what I did in the case of this table here. Look at position as running back, rank last year. So I grouped it in sixes. So if you can think about the top half, RB1, the bottom half, 7 to 12, so forth. So you can kind of, by twos, go down and see the running back 1, 2s, 3s, 4s, all the way down to running back sixes. Then I made a grand average of the next year's production, and not surprising, there is a trend, right? Last year's, who were in the top 1 to 6, produced the next year more points than the 67th through 72nd. So just intuitively, if you somehow think, oh, I should completely throw out, then there should be no pattern, right? It should just all not mean anything. We don't see that. So I think you can throw out that extreme, okay? If you've arrived at that extreme, that's not how I would proceed. However, some people say, oh, we should completely use all that. There's some variation here, and I'm not buying that extreme either. So, I'm just kind of telling you, I'm not in the two extreme camps. So fantasy point averages. There's also variation, considered uncertainty. And lo and behold, we have a lot of variation from year to year. in the top 18. Okay, the highest. So I'm thinking that those who would argue throw out last year are based on the level of uncertainty that they feel or see, I guess. Okay. Uh, Maybe, but there's still trends and patterns. Okay. Because the fantasy point averages do have a pattern. Okay. There is a trend. Okay. So I understand uncertainty, but you have to look at production as well. So they have to be both juggled, right? Don't you wish stats you could just have one number to mean everything? Okay, and people think ADP is that number. ADP is an average of a group of people who are sampled. Okay, there's going to be extremes. So people, you need to think about what ADPs are and aren't. And I've actually doing the data right now. I'm way ahead. I'm hundreds of figures ahead. Oh yeah, hundreds. We're not hundreds of figures ahead on that. And I actually going to be looking at ADP uh, from last year and year to year and kind of see what it all means. But right now we're just using crude rankings. A lot of variation early on. So the highest uncertainty is early in your drafts versus late in your drafts. If you look at, up in here, less uncertainty. So I think you could be more assured that if some running back was 55th or less, you have a greater uh, level of expectation that they're not going to really do a lot. However, the 1 to 18, you have a high uncertainty of what they will do. So it's kind of a balanced, or I guess it's an unbalanced situation. So the deeper you get into the draft, it's safer, but you're not going to find the sleepers. But there are some cases, and if you go back to the data, maybe not as deep as 55th, but maybe up, that there were some turnarounds. So I think there are some sleeper types that have been shown out there, but they're not just falling off the trees like low-hanging fruit either. Okay, you got to work for them. Okay, stumble around 30 minutes before you draft and hope you're going to grab somebody. Or worse yet, you listen to somebody on the Twitter or something, says something. It's like, okay, uh, how do they know, And if they can predict the future, they should probably be playing the stock market, not trying to flip around on Twitter. It'd be a waste of their time. Also put down seedling and floor. So what's the best we saw in 7 years? What's the worst? So isn't that interesting that you would think, oh, 1 to 6, I'm, safe. No, highest variation, and look at the gap. 220-point gap from the best to the worst. Okay. 220. And, you're not seeing as much of that gap in the other segments. So the 1st to 6th, the range of outcomes as predicted by the variation is greatest. So it's really tricky to pick your top 6. Okay. Somewhat tricky the next 6, right? 7th to 12th. Okay, some people say, well, that's why I do zero running back because of all those failures. I understand. There were 4 out of 7 successes, 3 out of 7 failures. I got that. So, was it 60-40, just me ballparking it there? Okay, so 40% chance you blow up. Okay, but now you know that, and that's what reference class forecasting allows us. We go in with our eyes open. Okay, we're not asleep. Okay, we're not asleep. Let our other competitors be asleep. Let them use the people on Twitter. I'll use my data. I'll trust my process. In fact, I think it should be the process. Hey, we all have an ego at some point. Hopefully you're listening, by the way. Most people are not going to be. That's fine. That's why I make money, because most people don't. That's great. I hope they, you know, print off a sheet 10 minutes before the draft, come into it. I'll crush them. So that's great. But I still have this desire. I don't know why some people say teachers are crazy. Why do we do all this for basically? I could have gone to medical school and made tons more money. Yeah. Somebody said, well, you couldn't get in medical school. I got my PhD and I took several medical courses and did fairly well. Okay, I took the national board for my final test in micro and biochemistry. I did well. So, yeah, I could have. In fact, we had a couple of my colleagues got a PhD and went right into medical school. Uh, I was a little bit older and I wanted to start drawing a paycheck at some point. So, anyway. So right now the take home is the variation. There's a trend from last year to this year. I didn't say it's a perfect trend. Did you hear me? No. I'm probably not a fan of the extremes, but the gaps from ceiling to floor does keep my attention high on what I'm doing. And there's danger early on, and that danger on average goes down. Okay. So think about that. Let's go next, see what other fun. Oh, so I plotted it. So if you look at the fantasy points over here on the y-axis, and then here's the sectors on the x-axis, here's the fantasy point average, and it's going down. And that's a pretty good trend, folks. Those that, we can't use last year's rankings. That's a hell of a trend if that's the case. So I'm right now I'm rejecting that hypothesis because I believe this data falsifies that hypothesis. Okay, falsifies it. Doesn't prove it. It just falsifies that idea. The yellow, I'm sorry, that was the yellow line. The green line is the ceiling, and then the red is the floor. And notice the gaps are higher up here, okay, and the gap kind of shrinks. For the most part, that's the trend. Okay, and here's the average. I mean, I understand there is some linearness to it, but there's still some trends as well. But I'm going to suggest that last year's rankings have use, maybe more than people think, which is good. So if the majority of people think that something is not useful when it really is, or if it's halfway usable. So again, are the extremes the other way? They're just, you win either way if people are stuck on the extremes in a situation. The variation is shown in purple. It's a lot more closer to variation, kind of a little bit more linear, a little bit tilted. But that's kind of where we're at if you smooth out the curves there. Okay, let's continue. If we take the same data, same sectors, and make the top fantasy point average to be 100%, then we take each sector, what percent of the top is that fantasy point average. So 100%, 83, 76, so forth down to in the 20s here. Okay. In the 20s. That's a pretty good trend. The further we go down, the less fantasy points those players are returning. This is last year's rankings, not this year's. That's ADP, last year's. Okay. So if nothing else, and maybe, those that are last minute, I guess if you had to have one factor, you probably should pay attention to last year's. I don't think if you play enough leagues, that you'll win your leagues by doing that, because I think you got to have more to it. But I guess if you're doing one league, you might get lucky. So maybe that is the extreme people use last year's rankings. I don't know. Variation. 100% top variation was in the first through sixth running back from last year. The riskiest, I guess, but it's really the uncertaintiest. And then we see the percentile of the uncertainty levels drop. But not drop as fast as you would think. We dropped by 16%. And so 16% of 86 would be around 60. And notice we have one drop here, 16, and it takes all the way down to nearly here to drop another 16%. So in some ways, it's kind of stays focused. I mean, I know we're close here, but it popped back up. So the variation is less trending than the fantasy point average. What about the relationship of the uncertainty versus the points? So I actually took a ratio of the fantasy points to variation, and I did the inverse of that ratio, variation fantasy points. So I wanted to see, relative to your returns of the fantasy points, what was the nature of the uncertainty. And if you look at it that way, you actually see that the return on if you call it your draft capital or investment, is very poor after 36 pick from last year. So if I am forced to go, I'm thinking the top 36 is something that I think would be a better guide than 37th to 72nd, because the uncertainty versus the return is really wacky at that point. Look at that. I think that's given us a big signal that, you kind of probably should throw out last year's rankings at that point. So you might do your research and just look at last year's top 36. That's how I'm going to play the data. Okay, I think that's how we should play the data. Okay, So when I say, remember, when I say play the data, that doesn't mean we're, digging a ditch and we're wearing cement shoes and we can't get out of it. Okay? We've got to be nimble and flexible at all times, right? And you cannot be comfortable until after the draft's done. You've done it. Okay, it's done. Now we can talk about trades and other things at that point if you have buyer's regret and things. But that's when, you did all you could do, right? It's the process, it's not the outcome. That's what this whole thing is about, is I'm teaching you a process. The outcomes are going to be the outcomes. All we can do is control the process going up to it. Injuries happen, funny things happen along the way across the years, right? It just happens. We cannot control the outcomes, okay? Unless we're magic, and none of us are magic. So quit. And we had this lecture, outcomes versus process. That's why I named this not the outcomes. Dr. Bush's the outcomes. It's the process. So my takeaway is I really wouldn't spend too much time as far as being stuck on the 37th to 72nd, right? That doesn't mean I'm not looking for sleepers or other possibilities and changes and things. It just means that I'm looking hard at what we saw last year first. Kind of, that's my starting point. That's my reference class of the whole journey. Okay, so I want you to understand that. Okay, that's just how we need to proceed. And I do like this ratio, by the way. That's the data can talk to us if we're willing to listen. Okay. And this is just me plotting. And I plotted the fantasy point average here, and we see the trend. Notice the variation. So about right here. Okay, right here it really does. But look, right here at, which one is this? 37th. Remember I said we should probably stop right there. Here's the 37th. This is variation, folks. This is uncertainty. Right here. You see what's going on? It popped back up. But, okay, the return on our fantasy points, our draft capital, doesn't, it kind of flipped back up, but it's down again. So when you look at this ratio of uncertainty to actually what you're earning, it's not worth it. Yes, I understand the highest uncertainty, but it's in the sector that's the highest return. Okay? So you got something to play for there. That's another way to look at it. It's uncertain, but you're going to get, if you hit, you're going to get pretty good payoff. So I think you can say worth a gamble, and the 37th is that break line there. It's another way to say what I just said, right? I know Dr. Bush likes to talk. I think it's neat. Good data. I love colors. Sometimes I admire the data. I'm a data artist. I don't know if there's such a thing, but that's what I really feel like. Using colors and illustrations to bring home the points, reference class forecast, to help us in the process. That's what I like to do. Here's another way to look at it. Taking the same data, the fantasy point versus variance, right? That ratio. And notice things really changed at the 37th. I put a little star here It's like, whoa, it's like a completely different game just happened. Here's this game, very low, and then all of a sudden something happened right in here. Isn't it? That's what intrigues me. Why does it happen like that? That's the question. What does that mean? You know, the light, the crystal ball can only go so far, and it's telling me that the running backs from last year deep in, there's going to be so much changes that's going to be effective, whereas a lot of teams kind of know what they have in this group, and they're not, their roles are probably not going to significantly change, right? So, hey, I know what I got last year versus, hey, didn't get much last year. Maybe some of them are good enough to do something different, to maybe move in here. I think, I want to think that's what the deeper analysis is. Okay, and I'm catching it 37th pick running back now. So think about that. Okay, so part of our journey is we can have data, we can look at it. How do we know that it's not just random? If you flip a coin and there's 10 heads in a row, is the coin two-headed? Or it's just one of those rare situations where you get 10 heads in a row? So it's probability theory. Statistical testing is a way for us to look at the data and compare groups and sectors in our data and ask the question, is there some real difference here? Is the variation change based on the groupings, or is it based on randomness? Can we trust the data and what it's saying or not? I guess that's kind of a way to think about it. So there's a couple tests that I use when I'm looking at multiple groups. We had a lot of sectors, remember? 1 to 6, 7 to 2. Those are all groups. So I'm going to look at all those sectors and ask the question, are the sectors the same or different when we compare them to other sectors? Okay. I just want to see what's irrelevant. What can we trust? What can't we trust? So ANOVA, it says one way ANOVA of your K8 independent treatments. So they're saying each sector's a treatment in this verbiage here. Don't worry about that. 8 sectors. Analysis of variation. Is the variation within your group due to the grouping, or is it random? Another way to say it. So there's a bunch of numbers, things that unless you take stats, you probably shouldn't worry about. The only number to take away is this number here, the p-value. The probability that we can reject the groupings means something, okay? That's the number. And we accept a 5% error rate. We'll be wrong 5% of the time. 0.05. Anything below 0.05, we do not eliminate our groupings. We assume that there is an issue. We're talking 6 times 10 to the minus 12. So we're talking 6 with, 12 zeros in front of it? That is very significant. What that means, since it's so low, is there is at least one segment that is different from another group. At least one, could be many. could be every group is different for the preceding group. Okay, we know that it's not randomness now. Something really is real. That's what that, and that is such a nice feeling as a data person to feel that. So let's go and see what we see next. Okay, so a little bit of numbers here. Let me walk through it. First, if you remember the segments, running backs that were ranked last year, 1 to 6, they generated a fantasy points. So I looked at all their fantasy point from the next year. Okay. I compared and generated that fantasy point average in all the groups. And this software considers every sector, won't let me name it. Okay, so it's just A, B, C. So each sector has a group. So I put this here, right? The software didn't. I did, so that you see when you see G versus H, it's comparing this sector. That I didn't go all the way down to 72nd. I just went to 48th. Okay. The Tukey, what a funny name, but there was a Dr. Tukey. Highest significant difference, HSD results. What that test says is the two groups or sectors are different or they're not. Can we believe the data and the difference that we see, or we shouldn't believe the data, which is interesting. So here's the actual Q stat. Don't worry about that. Here's the bottom line, that inference. If you see a p-value below 0.0105, then it's said to be significant and the two sectors are different, statistically different. If they are not statistically different, it's said to be insignificant. And notice we see some differences and non-differences. Okay, the top sector, this data is really interesting. Even though the data would say, oh, the top 1 to 6 produce more points, the Tukey testing says we should ignore A versus B and A versus C. And we should treat the top 18 running backs to be, from last year, their numbers this year to be no different. So that kind of was not what I was hoping for, right? So that makes it a little cloudy in our use of our last year's rankings. So that means that 1 to 6 is not much different than 7 to 12 or 13 to 18. This may be why some people suggest that last year's rankings are not relevant. Maybe they have run this test. Well, but that's not completely accurate, because the 1 to 6 is completely different. D, E, F, G, and H running backs from last year. So all running backs that were 19th or less were significantly lower than running backs 1st through 6th last year. You can hang your hat on that. That's what these A through H say. So there is some distinction here. If there was no distinction, this would all be insignificant, and that would mean you cannot rely on last year's rankings at all. You could just completely throw it out. So when I said I was not a fan of the extremes would be all green or all red, and we don't see that. Okay, So it's never all or none, right? In life, there's always some shades of gray. Well, this is pretty clear here. So, what about B versus D, E, F, and G? We can look and see that B is only different from E, F, G, and H. So if you look at running back 7th to 12th, you should not assume that 13th through 24th are different. You should assume they're all groups. So there's this group, there's this group right here. And you're saying, well, that overlaps. That's part of life. It's not clean. Okay? So there's some ambiguity there and some subtleness that you just have to live with. Okay? Some people say, that's why I don't like numbers, because they're not, well, that's why I hate to gamble, because I never lose or win. Come on now. So, what about C? C is pretty much about the same. So, we lose any big grouping at C. So, I would not, even though I said look at 1 to 18, I think I would focus on 1 to 12. You get the biggest change, but just keep it in mind that you cannot hang your hat on any one sector being super superior. There are some limitations. Here are the limitations. I wish it was clearer than this, but it's not. Can't make it clear. Yes, I see that G is different, but since it's surrounded by that, I'm going to play like it's insignificant, okay? But there it is. Okay, there it is. Another test, which is kind of interesting, Buffoni and Holmes test, which Tukey is one way. I know stats is tricky because you can use another test if you don't like what you get. You're not supposed to do that, right? You're supposed to live and die. But you can look. And so what this says was that A and B are to be considered the same, and A is completely different than C to H. So I think with the second test, I'm living 1 to 12 running backs from last year. I'm living that those are pretty much not different this year. That, we'll live it. But I would not start looking too deep past 13th to say that, as a group, that there's going to be lots of running backs there. They're going to make it up the list. It's probably not as many as we think. So I think that's the takeaway from the rankings from last year. It's not clean data. This Bonferroni, I guess, Bonferroni, sound like macaroni. I'm sorry, that was his professor, and Holmes or Home. This is almost as clean as you can get, but it only allows us to compare A to everybody else. So I think that's how I'm going to treat this data. There's some other takeaways. You can go back and re-listen, but that's definitely one takeaway here. That looking for the top running backs. Now remember, this doesn't look at last year's rookies because, this year's rookies, because they didn't have it last year. So realize we're blind in kind of Saquon Barkley or anything that pops up. So you've got to live with that blind spot as well. Okay, it's just not as clean as I would love it, but it is what it is, and you just, you live with it. Wide receivers. Okay, told you we're going to look at uh, the wide receivers here, and we will with the next lesson. And because we're 45 minutes in, I know you're wore out, and I'm wore out. So we're going to shut this puppy down and see what's going on for next time. Join me for the process. We will use our Tukey and ANOVA testing to figure things out. Come back. I know you want to see lesson 34. Come on now. Good stuff. Take care.